So when I put together my monthly builds parts lists, as I did for this system last month, I try to choose compatible parts to fit within the budget that make sense based on the price of each component and that can be assembled into the best system possible for your needs. Sometimes, when I do the follow-up video where I build the system to test it, I find that my initial choices weren't ideal. Case in point, today we're going to be testing this system that I put together in the Lian TU150 Mini ITX or Mini DTX case, and it's a tale of mixed feelings about my choices, an early build that I did with hardware that wasn't final, some mixed testing, and my updated thoughts now that I've worked with it for a couple weeks. Sometimes parts that I work with seem to have a natural fit, and I think there is a perfect build for this case, which I almost pulled off, but not quite. I'll cover the ideal build in this case, in my humble opinion, at the end of this video.
Excellent!
Before any of that though, when I initially put this system together over a month ago, there were some questions that needed answering, such as, how did that memory kit work out for you? How are the thermals inside the TU150 case? And what difference did that big motherboard upgrade make that I waited around so long to actually install? Well, let's start with the memory. This is a 3600 speed Patriot kit, and long story short, I chose it because it was less expensive, didn't have terrible timings, was 3600 speed, 2x8 gigs for 16 gigs total, and it seemed like an ideal fit if it played nice with the Ryzen 3000 series processor. Long story short, it did not. It was not compatible when I did XMP settings out of the box. I tried several times to tweak the tunings and the timings to go for lower frequency or looser timings. Eventually, I decided for the sake of testing to just not use this kit. For one, I was trying to get this video out last week and I was trying to save a little bit of time. Secondly though, I have perfectly viable G.Skill Trident Z Royal RGB memory, and although it doesn't quite fit with the rest of the design aesthetic of this system, which is why right now I've installed a Team kit just because it looks prettier, but I was able to easily plug in the XMP settings, so for the testing that you're going to see today, I was running the memory at 3600 speed, cast latency 16, and we're good to go. Speaking of testing, I did make some attempts at stress testing for some temperature results, and I'm going to share those with you right now, although they were separated by about a week, so I can't validate that my ambient temperatures were the same. That said, I have some second opinion testing for thermals that I'm going to get to after I go over my results, but we started with the original setup. That was the original build that was put together in this case, which featured a Race Spire cooler for our 3700X CPU, the Gigabyte B450i Aorus Pro Wi-Fi motherboard, which I was able to update the UEFI on to be compatible with our Ryzen 3000 series processor. The memory was of course the DDR4 kit running at 3600 cast latency 16, and after a 10-minute IDA64 burn-in test, our CPU's peak temperature hit 85.6 degrees Celsius, which is pretty warm, but not to the point where it's going to shut the system down or anything, although if we were able to lower that temperature, we'd probably get a little bit better frequencies out of our processor. Average temperature after 10 minutes was 82.5 degrees Celsius, and it seemed to be relatively stable at that since it was using an air cooler. When I initially started the test, the CPU frequency was varying between about 4.15 to 4.2 gigahertz. It hit 4.192 gigahertz max, and then after 10 minutes, it did throttle that frequency down just a little bit, so it was about 4.042 to 4.067 gigahertz, sometimes dipping down to 4.019, but between 4 and 4.1 basically is where it was sitting, which is not the best, but it's not too bad either. Next up, because this case does support water cooling in limited capacity, it supports 120 millimeter all-in-one liquid coolers, so I wanted to swap one of those in to see what sort of difference it would make. Bear in mind that we primarily have one intake on this case, the 120 millimeter front fan, and one exhaust in the 120 millimeter exhaust fan at the back, so the radiator has now been added on top of that, which is going to dampen the exhaust airflow just a little bit. You can add two more 120 millimeter fans to the bottom of the case as intakes. I decided not to go for that and basically just rely on my graphics card down here, sucking up air to give a little bit more airflow there. Fortunately, the graphics card temperature was never outside the range that I experienced when I tested it outside the case, so that was just fine. But more to the point, my ML120R RGB from Cooler Master is not the ideal 120mm all-in-one liquid cooler to use with this case, and that's primarily because the pump block unit on it is a bit taller than most. So although it did greatly reduce the amount of noise that was being output by the system, the quietude was offset by the fact that I couldn't do push-pull with the radiator simply because of a conflict with the pump block down there where the CPU mount is. That's unfortunate, but I still went ahead and ran the testing. So after a 10-minute IDA64 burn-in test, CPU peak temperature was 89 degrees Celsius. And my first thought there was like, wait, that's hotter. That's hotter than it was before. That's not very ideal. Average temperature after 10 minutes was 82.3 degrees Celsius, and that is a little bit cooler than the air cooler, but it was still climbing, and sustained it was hitting about 86 to 87 degrees Celsius, so I'm pretty confident that if I had let that going for longer, the average temperature would have gotten hotter than the Wraith cooler as well. Starting frequency though was about 4.15 to 4.2 gigahertz, about the same as the original configuration. Frequency after 10 minutes was 4.019 to 4.042, which jumps up to 4.067. Peak at 4.317, but we don't really care as much about the peak frequency. We care about what it was running at on average, and it did seem to run at a lower frequency with this cooler while also running hotter, which is not good. And my explanation for why there was this difference in a perceived drop in frequency while there was an increase in temperature is for a couple different reasons. One is due to the impeded exhaust airflow that was caused by adding the radiator there, which probably meant that the internal temperatures, just the ambient temperatures inside, were getting hotter than they were before. Second would be the VRM MOSFETs. There is a temperature sensor on that for the Gigabyte motherboard I was using. They were running at 67 degrees Celsius with the air cooler. With this cooler, they jumped up to 76 degrees Celsius, so that might have been potentially why the frequency wasn't going up as high. I will fully admit at this point I should have done further testing with that configuration, but like I said, I was trying to get this video posted last week, so I was in a bit of a rush, so I went ahead and did the motherboard upgrade next. So I swapped out that original Gigabyte B450 motherboard and upgraded to this, the Asus Crosshair 8 Impact, which is probably the cream of the crop when it comes to X570 motherboards that are small form factor, that are trying to give you the full features that you would get with an ATX motherboard in a much smaller size. I did a video specifically on this motherboard, so if you want some more details on it, feel free to check that out. Other than that, I was using all of the same hardware and the same configuration when it comes to the memory and the cooler and everything. After my 10-minute IDA64 burn-in test, CPU peak temperature was 84.3 degrees Celsius. That's 5 degrees cooler. Average temperature was also down, 76.9 degrees Celsius. It seemed to like to stay around 77. CPU starting frequency was about the same, about 4.15 to 4.2 gigahertz. It hit 4.217 gigahertz max, but I also noticed that outside of my test run, the frequency was regularly going up to 4.4 gigahertz on a single core. CPU frequency after 10 minutes of the burn-in test was 4.092 to 4.142. So we got maybe 50 hertz increased improvement over the first configuration, which is nice, because the hardware is now more expensive that's in there. The last thing I want to point out is, again, there is a VRM Temp Sensor here, but this is a part of the Asus separate sensor array, and it's a completely different motherboard. The sensor temperature said 42 degrees Celsius for the VRMs, which is a very nice, reasonable, cool temperature, but again, completely different motherboard than the original test, so I can't quite say that's an A-B comparison, but possibly an indication that the active fans cooling the VRMs and the chipset on this board are actually doing their job. Now, I already mentioned that I wasn't 100% satisfied with my thermal testing for this case due to various reasons, so I decided to get a second opinion. I'm going to reference a couple other YouTube videos that also tested this case, and I'll post links to those down in the description if you are interested. First off, we have our good friend Dimitri over at Hardware Connects, who did a bit of thermal testing on this case, and basically here are his graphs. He was using an air cooler, the Noctua NHU12A, and he was comparing it to a Cooler Master H100 based system, but he did find that the TU150 was running significantly cooler there. We also have a video by Optimum Tech, which I recommend because he does a nice side-by-side comparison with a lot of the small form factor cases that are out there and available. But his CPU temperature testing showed that this case performed among the best of the small form factor cases that he has tested in the past. Both the CPU and the GPU thermals were well within range, so I don't think anyone should necessarily be immediately concerned about the thermal performance of this case, depending on the hardware that you install inside. It does seem like the added performance you might get from an all-in-one cooler, because you're limited to a 120mm version of those, might not be that much greater than you would get with an air cooler, and it is nice that there's plenty of horizontal space, I guess, for larger size air coolers. Many of them will fit in this case. That said though, if you are considering dropping a lot of higher end hardware in the system, you definitely want to consider either some lower profile fans or some larger fans to fit down in the 220mm mounts at the bottom. You can also do a 240mm radiator down there if you're doing something like going with a shorter graphics card that you're going to water cool, so it would only be a slot or a slot and a half of space taken up. But at this point, I think I just have a few random notes that I put together as I was building and rebuilding in this system that I wanted to share with you guys, because they might be interesting if you're planning on building in this case. First off, that front 120mm intake fan I think could have been just a little bit more flexible. Right now it's positioned to where the top is right up against the power supply. The bottom is basically right up against where a graphics card would be, so I think they put it where it's put so that you have enough room for the power supply and still enough room for a very long graphics card, which was definitely helpful for me with this very long Zotac 2080 Super that I have in here. In fact, in order to get the 2080 Super in and out, I had to actually remove that fan, or at least unmount that fan, just so I could angle it down into there. What I think Lian Li should have done is make that gap on the front just a little bit taller and make the rail style mounts for the 4 mounting points for the fan. That way, if you were using a shorter GPU, you could slide it down just a little bit. If you were using a much shorter GPU, you would even have room for a radiator and fan there at the front, and I think that would have made it a lot more flexible. I was at one point considering moving this radiator mount for the all-in-one over to the fronts, so I could maybe do push-pull up there, but then I realized there's just no room for it, especially with where the fan mounts are in relation to the power supply. Speaking of that 120mm all-in-one liquid cooler, as I already mentioned, this Cooler Master ML120R RGB is just not the best choice for this case. Push-pull fans is the way to go to get some extra cooling performance out of a small radiator like 120mm, but the taller CPU pump block on this only gives you enough room for one fan and the radiator. A unit with a lower profile pump block would be better. Another thing to point out, and this is a little bit random, but the audio outs on the Crosshair 8 Impact, now that I have it set up and turned on, do have colored LEDs in them. When it comes to RGB LEDs in modern day computers, they're often just aesthetic, but this is the most practical use of them, at least in my mind. If you're ever trying to reach back behind your computer case to plug in a mic and a headphone jack and you can't read the labels, LEDs on them makes it much, much better, and especially if it's dark back there. They're really nice. Every time I use them, I'm like, that's a good idea. Asus, keep doing that. I guess also, since we're talking about RGB, the Republic of Gamers logo on that riser card for the SODIMM.2 also lights up, and it's actually a very nice, evenly lit one as it goes across it. And then lastly, I wanted to get back to that thing I mentioned at the beginning, the ideal build in this case. Sometimes I get pieces of computer hardware and I feel like they just call out to me because there are specific ideal components that go inside there. For example, we're talking about the TU150. It wants mini DTX support. It's one of the first cases to officially list that out of the box. And although there are other mini DTX motherboards out there, not many of them that are geared towards gaming PCs and that are higher end like the Crosshair 8 Impact is. Second factor is that we have a front panel USB-C port, that 3.1 Gen 2 one. And while there are some mini ITX Intel motherboards that support that plug, there are none on the AM4 side. And if you want to fit the most compute power in a mini ITX form factor, in a case like this, you really want to go with AMD. And this is really the only motherboard that's mini DTX to fit that form factor, that also has that USB-C 3.1 Gen 2 port. And so that's the board you should install in this case, in my personal opinion. However, as mentioned in the video where I went over this motherboard, Asus is asking a pretty penny for it. They're saying that the initial starting price is going to be around $400, and they won't even confirm that absolutely as of yet. So if you have this case and you want to get that motherboard because it's the best fit, and the motherboard costs $400, then you got to choose a CPU to go in there. And personally, I don't think anyone should buy a motherboard that costs more than their CPU. That's just a rule that I have. So there is only one, possibly two CPUs that should go in this motherboard in this case. That would be the 3900X that's currently out and available, although available should be taken with a grain of salt because they're not actually available for sale anywhere. But try to get your hands on one. You could also go with the unreleased R9 3950X, but that's been delayed till November, so you have to wait around a little bit more for that. All that said, I did an updated PC part picker list with the 3900X, with a Corsair H75, which is going to have a lower profile CPU mount that would let you do push-pull. The Crosshair 8 Impact, of course. I got an upgraded memory kit that's still 2x8 gigs DDR4 3600, but it's the G.Skill Trident Z Neo kit, which will work with XMP values to get your rated memory speeds on this motherboard. I dropped in a 1TB Crucial NVMe SSD, the same Zotac RTX 2080 Super Gaming Amp graphics card, the Lian Li Mini ITX case, the Corsair SF 750 watt power supply, and we gotta have some fans in there. I've been using the Lian Li BR series digital 120mm fans, so I dropped those in there too, and we're looking at around $2,300 as compared to when I originally parted the system out in this case, which is at $1,550. So you want to spend more money to get the appropriate system, in my opinion, to put in the Lian Li TU150. That is, of course, just my opinion though, so So I'm curious what your opinions are about this case, about the sort of process I've gone through when it comes to choice of components, swapping things in and out, my admittedly flawed testing methodologies for this video, but I would be very curious to know what you guys think of this in the comment section down below. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, hit the thumbs up button on your way out. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will link the parts I've used as well as the other videos I did on the components in this case in the description, and we'll see you guys in the next video.